Tonight, if you will, we will settle down beside a small, comfortable fire and let the day fall away. I will tell you a long, gentle story, a slow, winding tale of wonder and of quiet courage drawn from an old adventure. The scenes are broad and strange, and the hearts in it are honest. There are cliffs and green rivers, great quiet forests, and a secret sunlit plateau full of living mysteries from a darker age. There are friends who quarrel and then stand together. A stormy, tremendous man with a beard like a black cloud. A brave, steady hunter with cold blue eyes. A thoughtful scholar with a pipe. And a young reporter who sets out because he believes in honor. And because a woman he loves believes that there are heroisms all around. You will hear the crinkle of dry leaves, the hush of distant water, and the low rhythm of a rowing boat upon a long river. Let your breathing slow and become as steady as the oars, and listen as the tale opens, soft and sure, like the opening of a book in a warm, lamplit room. Once in a time not quite like ours, and yet very much like it, there was a quiet stationer's office and a string of city streets where fog could sit and tug at the lamplights. In such a place lived a young man who wrote down what happened in the world. He was a reporter. He was a careful fellow. His thoughts were clear and honest, and he kept a small drawer of curios that comforted him: an old coin, a pressed leaf, the stub of a pencil. He kept company with friends whose faces were known to the clubs and to coffee rooms. He had a ready laugh and a quick temper, and his life moved in predictable sweeps. The clack of a typewriter, the rush of a coach, the ordinary small and steady dramas that make up a day. But in the doorway of that regular life, there stood Gladys, a woman whose voice was the kind that calms, whose eyes were steady lights, and whose words invited the impossible. She spoke once of men who do great things, of travelers whose names the world remembers, of quiet loves warmed by the reflected light of far adventures. She did not say she loved those men for themselves alone. She loved the light that followed them, the good deeds, the stories. She spoke quietly of heroism. Her voice did more than nudge. It set the young reporter's heart into a new rhythm. He felt, in that honest, sudden way that the world sometimes grants, that there are things to be done, and that one cannot stay always by the fire. If he had been a sculptor or a carpenter, perhaps his heroism would have been the shape of a chair or a wooden stair. But he was a man of words and questions. He could chase a story into a smoke-filled alley and come back with the bones of a piece worth remembering. But he longed for something larger, something that would lift him clean out of his ordinary days, a deed that could stand under Gladys's eyes and be called worthy. One evening, after he had listened to the old rhythm of the world, he took a letter and a hope and walked beneath street lamps to talk to a man who knew how to set such long dreams to motion, a low, watchful editor who smelled of prints and coffee. He wanted, in the simple, honest way of young men who have found a new calling, be sent on a mission. The request itself was not bold. He asked for a chance to be in the midst of things that mattered. But it carried the hunger of a heart that had grown too large inside a small life. The editor, a careful man who had a fondness for orderly things, laughed softly and suggested all manner of safer tasks. He told stories of busy men and well-worn streets, and at last, smiling as if a small joke had pleased him, he suggested a man who was known to be an oddity, Professor Challenger. The name was like a pebble dropped into a bowl. It threw up concentric ripples. The professor was a man with the sort of noise about him that fills a room from corner to corner. He had come back once from a journey to the wild places of the world, bearing tales that did not sit neatly with the scholars. He wore opinions like a thick coat, heavy, bright, slightly out of style for the polite company of learned men. People disliked him because he was blunt, and because, when he believed something firmly, he believed without shade or doubt. People also feared what they did not quite understand. The editor suggested the reporter go gently. Perhaps the professor could be steadied by curiosity. So the reporter took a small book of questions, a will like a warm ember, and a letter shaped like a fan of polite words written to the professor. He found, as is often the way with honest effort, that kindness reached people where cleverness could not. Or perhaps it was simply curiosity. The professor responded with a letter that was both sharp and oddly respectful. He agreed to see the reporter. What followed that first meeting took the young man like a wind that moves at once toward the sea. At the professor's house, the reporter met a terrible, large man, heavy in the chest and in the voice, with a forehead like a carved stone and a beard wide and thick, with eyes that could narrow like shutters. He was at once infuriating and majestic, booming at the stranger, deriding the foolish, puffing with great good humor and savage sarcasm. The home was well filled with books, maps, strange drawings, and the brazier of strong cigar ash. The professor, for all his dreadful brusqueness, spoke of his trip to South America in a way that was not merely loud, but filled with the hush that comes when a person speaks of something he knows deep in his bones. He had been to a place that was cut off by great cliffs and whose top held a green world unchanged, where slumbers of life from older ages persisted, animals and birds, as if the great wheel of time had rejected their names. The professor placed before the reporter a battered sketchbook. Drawn in earnest, it held pictures made by an earlier traveler, scenes of broad cliffs, as if painted by iron-red hands, and then a drawing of a strange, warty creature like some lost page of a fantasy. The professor set down a fossil bone that was a real bone, not old at all, but recent, with a texture like a thing that had cut the world. He produced a wing fragment like a strange cloth of bones and membrane, and like a teacher who wants to give the class a glimpse of truth, he daringly said, "This is what we have found." He told of a man who had been found dead at the foot of a cliff, an artist who had seen something of that strange highland. The professor's voice rose and fell, and finally nodded at the photographs he had not been able to keep, the broken plates of film sent to ruins by one careless wave. His argument was a shaping hand upon the shoulder of the world. He had seen a plateau, a mighty natural vault of land, raised up and sealed by cliffs of basalt, hard, vertical, impossible. And upon that secret top, the ancient had been saved as if in a time capsule. Creatures that the textbook said had long ago vanished were alive and moving and breathing there. There were, too, tales among the river people of this place. The Indians of the forests had their names for the great spirit of the woods, the Curupiri, and it had shivered them with fear. The reporter listened and felt his hands fall in his lap. The world he had known well-worn and known stretched and widened. The ache for an honorable deed quickened. Before he returned to his fog and his ledger, he had promised his aid. He would go. There were others who would go with him, men of different sorts, who make difficult expeditions, human and whole. A tall, spare, and handsome man strode into the story next, a sportsman who had been in many places where men with quiet eyes learn the way of animals and weather. He had kept a carefully folded life of courage. Then there was a thin, iron professor of anatomy, a man of precise knowledge and a dry, acidic humor. His face could be a hard comment upon the world, and he loved his facts like a lamp loves oil. Each of them, with their needs, their pride, and the vow he or she carried, would be a living thread that made the whole stronger. They would be joined by a faithful, massive servant with wide arms and a slow grin, half a dozen nimble river people who knew the tides and the reeds, and could row as if the water were a second home, and by two half-breed guides who had hands like small cats and the patience of the jungle. They boarded a liner and sailed across an ocean toward a delta, and then went up the great river, hearing the slow voice of the Amazon as if it were the world's backbone. There were many small pleasures along the way. Nights where the trees slanted across and made blue lattices of light, the steady thud and idiom of an engine, a town with hot air and markets. At last, within a green cradle, the men reached a place called Manos, a town of bustling throats and easy hospitality. Here they waited for directions from Professor Challenger, who for the last part of their journey desired to appear as the one who guided them, avoiding interference and the broadcasting of his secret until the final hour. The professor arrived at the river and placed into their hands a sealed instruction, and within it, in cautious lines, he named a point, and then asked them to wait before they read the exact place until the appointed time. That was the first of many moments where secrecy and friendship leaned together. The river narrowed, and then it narrowed once more until it became a great ribbon of water, and the banks closed in with a thrill of the primeval. The men took canoes whose ribs were thin and sleek, and the trees leaned over as if to watch them pass. There were rapids that they passed around, and little villages of people who looked at their faces with the measured friendliness of those who have known no hurry, but know all the weather of the world. Overhead the parrots cried, and the monkeys made high music like something half remembered from a dream. The reporter walked among those great, vaulted aisles of tree trunks and felt a hush that made his pulse drop. Here was no mad city life, but long, slow forms of living, plants crowding to the light, leaves feeding one another with their reach. The night carried a chorus of frogs and a distant, slow drum of some bull-like insect. As they moved deeper inland, the country turned from the alluvial softness into the thicker, redder, more volcanic land. The canoes were left behind, and the men took up their packs. The steps became a slow, deliberate climb, and the crag change was like the frame shifting around a picture. At last, the plateau's edge emerged in a red-crimson wall sheer, rimmed in green, and beyond it, there was a high, flat world of trees and small trails. The region at the base of the cliff was filled with a quiet and a rumor. It was as if the earth itself held its breath. They moved along the base and searched for miles. The cliff was a firm dancer of stone without a seam for a man to climb. It was impossibly steep. They found marks where other men had tried, one or two small arrow-like signs upon the rock, where a traveler, perhaps in a surge of hope, had left a guide for those who might follow. They found, too, among tall cane and bamboo, the scattered bones of a man whose name and tattoos spoke of other rivers far away, an artist from a different shore who had tried to climb and had been impaled upon the pointed bamboo like a cruel, slow spike. It told them something. This was a place where some cunning human trap, or the sheer luck of a fall, had taken its toll. At last they found a single pinnacle, a steep church spire of rock jutting out from the cliff, crowned by the high tree. It was a slender, hurtful thing, and the gap between it and the plateau's rim was wide and terrible, a chasm that unrolled like a wound. The professor was a man of many plans. He had a coil of rope and some gadgets, and his eyes glinted like someone who loves a puzzle. It was possible, he said, to swing a fallen tree across the gap and make a bridge if they could, by some cleverness, cut down a nearby tall tree at an angle so the trunk would fall exactly across the abyss and rest upon the distant rim. The men set to their work with keen hands, and the reporter, strong, quick, climbed a ladder of branches like a boy. The tree fell. For a breath, the world seemed to hold its hand, and then it crashed, balanced, and reached at last to the other side. They had made a plank between the two worlds, and their hearts leaped. The first man to cross would be the professor. He hopped like a child, laughing at the danger, and as he danced, his friends followed. The bridge was alive with their weight, and they clambered across into a world that lay like a green garden with a gentle, warm light. It was a plateau that smelled like the hum of a midsummer garden, and yet it belonged to an older time. The plants were strange and wise in shape, and the ground itself seemed to remember things that had happened before men kept days and records. It was not the friendliness of the surface life alone that surprised them, but the sounds, the long, low call of large creatures, the bulging backs and tails moving at the water's rim, the heavy feathered sodders of branches. All of it was a soft, living museum. The men stood, their chests full, and the professor's eyes shone with triumph. And then, in a single, terrible instance, their bridge was torn and their world changed. From below in the rock, a rope had been pushed and twisted. Two half-breed traders, a pair of men who had followed them with the rust and ache of envy in their hearts, had shoved the felled trunk loose and let it topple away. The reporter watched as the tree swung away like a tide and fell, leaving the four human beings stranded upon the green island, with the cliff beyond them and the deep world down below. One of the two half-breeds had laughed and run. He had leapt and stumbled, and a single clean shot from an angry hunter's rifle ended him. The other had fallen to his own fate soon after. Even thus early in the tale, one learns that chance and justice often travel in uneven cars along the highways of life. They were marooned. The plateau was now both garden and cage. The rope they had stretching to the rim could not span the chasm, and there was no safe means to reach the base and the river again. The old, warm sunlight touched the shoulder of the trees, and the men felt both the wonder of discovery and the heavy cloak of their new limits. It made heroes of some men and teachers of others. They made camp on that green place. They held their courage carefully and watched. The island of light and leaf was filled with life, and yet that life had teeth and claws. They saw once, in the dawn, the great sweep of leathery wings of a pterodactyl rise from the reeds like the black stroke of a paintbrush. It was a creature both old and majestic, and it carried an odor and a cry that made the hairs on the back of a man's neck stand like feathers. They saw beasts like heavy kangaroos, with tails that buttressed their bodies and backs lined with bony plates, iguanodons that sat like a herd of silent, sleeping myths, browsing upon branches with grace. Their marks, deep and wide in the mud, made the men understand the scale of what they had entered. In the quiet green, the men found wonder and mystery at every turn, and their respect grew like a new habit. Yet the place also held more dangerous things. One moonlit night, while the men were sleeping, a shadow rushed a flying thing with teeth, and in a second it snatched at what had been set by their camp for supper. The leather of a leathery wing flapped like a strange flag. The professor and the others were nearly trampled in the confusion, but they lived and took the lesson. Caution grows from a dinner burned at the wrong time, and even more quietly men and things observed one another. Among the trees, there were creatures that climbed as men do creatures that were not quite ape, and not quite human. The reporter in the branch of a high beech saw a small, pale, hair-tufted face watching him with a look that was furious and wary and much like a mirror. It flashed away like a thought. The men called them 8 people and watched how they moved with the lithe, sharp intelligence of those who live at an edge. They also saw cave people, small, red, wiry folk who spoke in sudden signs and who lived in caves upon the inner face of the rim. These red folk, who had names and songs and a slow dignity, were friendly to the travelers because the travelers had helped them by smashing the great ape men and their own dark lords back into their defenses. The traveler's gun and the old hunter's mark had taught something to the situation. In certain narrow ways, man can change the world. The plateau gave up its secrets slowly and very honestly. The men learned to walk in its hush. They left thorn hedge rings around their camp, prepared a watch, and learned every thin sound of wings and the footstep of the iguanodon. In the morning, the researcher, the young reporter, and the hunter saw a great print in the mud, a 3-toed stride as big as a door, with a curious smaller handprint beside it. And then they found a herd of massive reptilian creatures, a family of iguanodons, who balanced upon their tails like green towers and ate leaves like beasts who had never learned fear. The thin man of science tasted the sweetness of being proved right, and the Athene of knowledge sat lightly on his shoulder. They mapped the world little by little. On a clear day, the young reporter, who climbed as a boy climbs and had no disdain for small bravery, got upon the very top of the highest ginkgo tree and saw the whole plateau as if it were a model. His breath caught at the sight, a wide, shallow bowl with a bright green lake at the center and beaches like pale jewels, the sides ringed with the red lip of the cliff. He traced the paths and marked the swamps, the shining lake, which he named in a quiet, warm moment, and which will be called the Central Lake, lay like a disk of memory at the plateau's heart. Around it, there were creatures that hunted the water silently, and others that walked its margin like ancient beasts asleep. Even amid the delight, they tasted a heavy sorrow. One night, alone and curious, and perhaps a bit impatient with his own cautious training, the young reporter left the camp. He had the small, restless, hopeful reason that sometimes takes a person to do something brave and dangerous. He wanted to witness the moonlit center alone and bring back light to his companions. He walked into the thick breath of the night and found, by and by, a deep black pool where the earth gurgled with heat and the mud bubbled with gas. He laid his head upon a rock and looked up at the cliffs and the moon and found the world very wide. He saw the light of fires in caves high upon the rim, and for a moment he thought he would rush up and knock upon a cave mouth and ask, "Who lives here?" But the quiet, small voice of caution leaned him back toward the camp, and he, with a hopeful mind, walked home. The night offered its rattle of fears. On the path, something moved and something hunted. He ran. He fell, and at the bottom of a pit, his mind slid like a down pillow. He awoke with the world backward and was shaken at the loss of time. He ran the last stretch and came upon the empty camp, the tents smashed and food taken, and a pool of dark color upon the ground where friends might have been. The heart of him froze, but then came a living step, a sound from the bottom of the cliff, and a black, slow, gentle figure. Sambo, steady as an island, sat and watched the plain. That man had remained like a rock. He did not run. The reporter did what men must do when fear is cruel. He wrote a letter and sent it below. A burning hope rides upon words, and the reporter, with hands that shook, but eyes that remembered, wrote the facts and rolled them into the tiny boat of an Indian who promised to go to the river, find men of help, and bring them back. It was a long shot over a long night. Meanwhile, the news found the hunter. The sportsman with a soul like a cliff could not remain idle when his friends were taken. He crept into the ape men's town, a forested nest with many huts, and with small red people who chattered and made signs. He saw with his own eyes how the professor had been made the mimic of an animal king. The ape man who had the professor's shape and beard, as if nature herself had painted a copy mocking and monstrous at once. He saw the cruel games and the things men did when fandom turns to cruelty. The bold hunter, with his easy, sure strength, struck down 2 of the ape men who laughed at him, and with courage he tore the ropes and took his friends back. It was a day when courage and guile together cut a way where there was no way before. They forced a rescue by boldness, and the plateau smiled and feared and then opened. Sun followed sun. The travelers came to know the life above the rim as if they had been born to it. The monstrous and slow saurians of the lake, the forarachus, a great running bird with a hooked beak and a will like a spear, the basin of the pterodactyl rookery that stank of 1,000 eggs and echoed with 1,000,000 small cries. Sometimes the professors, with their careful instruments and their patient index cards, lost themselves in wonder and missed the danger at the edge. At other times, the hunter, who had one eye always on what might run him down, found a thing that cleared a path for those who followed. And so, with small joys and small terrors, the men lived as if time had been turned back. They took a day to map the caves where the natives lived. They found sharp pits and traps and carved symbols upon the walls. They made friends with the red-skinned people who called themselves Akala, who helped them when they were wise, and they traded for food and were given names to wear. They learned much, how to read the line of an iguanodon's foot, which reed to choose for a torch that won't give too much heat, and the way a night's stillness hides 1,000 watchers. The plateau pitched them gently into its world and would not let them go, while they spent their days in wonder and drafting notes like men who gather shells on a shore. They still thought of the long, thin rope that would take them down to the world at the cliff's base. The professor, ever a man of hands as well as of head, had an idea of a different kind. He brewed a plan that seemed born of a child's brave dream and of an engineer's mind, to gather gas from the warm pools and fill a bag an honest living balloon, and carry 1 or 2 men down like a fruit dropped into a basket. He gathered huge inner linings of animals to make an envelope and attached canes and little bamboo tubes. He tested the bag with a stone and then with a lump of rock until it rose like a living thing and shot away into the sky. They lost a chunk of rock in the deep blue and nearly lost the professor in a mad leap when the bag yanked upward. And yet the plan was good in its simplest kind of genius. But the plateau is a place of paradox. In its shadows, men saw the highest of the old wonders and the hardest of the new aches. The men wanted to go home. They made a map and wrote letters to send down. They made a plan to carry a rope down and to go via a cave that might lead through. Once more, the reporter had a spell of daring and climbed a tree to look far and wide and saw, clearly, a pale slit in the wall of the cliff that was like a window, a cave that might go straight through to the other face. In this moment, a small map came from the young Akala, a simple charcoal diagram that showed the caves in a line, and marked one with an X. They went on hands and knees into the cave, counting heartbeats and hoping, and found that the passage, which had looked shallow, led far and deep, and opened at last to the pale light of the outside. There, the opening looked down like a window. The reporter looked and felt the world inside him rise like a prayer. The X meant a passage and a way down. The men set a rope to make the descent and felt the world tighten and breathe. That night, as dawn cooled into the soft light of leaving, the men tied their things and strapped up bundles. They were ready to go when the backbone of the world cried out in a different direction. Drums and shouts rose from the bush, and a wave of the ape people came in a wild dance of anger. The plateau rumbled like a stomach at a storm. The ape men had been driven to conquest and had not been finished with jealousy and cunning. They had maimed the rope in the night and set a mean and unkind shape to sever the fallen tree so that the travelers could not get back. The men were trapped. They had to find the way down from the high table that turned their knowledge into hunger. It was then that the red-skinned folk rose up. The Akala, who knew the plateau by the tip of their toes and the length of their moods, gathered up their spears and torches and marched and called their dead to what seemed the last measure of a long history. They were many and they were sure. The ape men were mustered and fought, and at last were put down. They were driven away, defeated not by the hunters' guns alone, but by a calm and certain response. The Akala had remembered the old injustices, and they struck and forced a victory. The smell of smoke hung over the plain, and the cliff's face echoed a sound like the thump of a drum. By then, the men were old friends of the Akala, and a sense of dignity and respect grew between them. After the conflict, the travelers could at last take their time to think of home. They found a cave passage marked and used it. They gathered what they could. They spoke quietly, and they loved their quiet. The sky looked brighter, and the world was a little kinder now that their sense of fear had been faced and averted. At last came the long descent. They carried bundles with care, and such fossils of beauty as they could spare. They held letters, parchments, and pieces of science that would interest a library and any dull afternoon. And they returned to the plain. They found Sambo waiting, steady as a lamp. They followed the river downstream, and when their boat at last lifted itself into the brown copper of the Amazon, and their hands felt once again the shock of the ocean wind, it was as a man waking from a strange sleep, where he had been asked to stand upon a distant shore and hold a better truth. In the quiet after their return, the men discovered the world would have to listen to their words. The young reporter, who had set out because there was a woman whose voice called him higher, would stand in a great hall before a sea of strangers to tell what he had seen. The hall filled with people who wanted either to believe or to find fault. Such crowds love the rattle of scandal and the calm of proof. The professors stood one by one and told their neat and detailed accounts. There were many who were gracious and many who were doubtful, but the men were honest and had facts, butterflies and bones and photographs, and a jar with the wing of some strange creature. There was an extraordinary moment when, at a meeting that had become breathless and tender and stormy all in a single beat of the heart, the professor opened a box and let out a creature that startled many of the listeners, a remembered and terrible shape that beat its wings, surprised by incandescent hall lights, and flapped itself out into the night. It rose and whooped and glowered and vanished down the street over the roofs like something gone back into a legend. Then the city, which is an animal that loves a story, took the news into its voice. Men cheered, women clapped, papers wrote at the speed of a machine. The men were heroes, the hunter with a grin, the old professor with his battered hat, the lathe of science with his pipe, the reporter who had set out in the first place because he had somewhere in his boy heart the wish to do something right for the woman who trusted him. And in the deeper rooms where roads cross and men take tea, there is a final close. The hunter, with pockets of treasure and a good, honest soul, found a pocket of diamonds in a blue clay, as one sometimes finds in the earth if one knows the right chalk streak to watch for. He brought these to those who had been faithful, and the world was altered a little by their return. The professor, who had stood much alone in a world that sometimes calls those who speak truth mad or rough, had a museum of his own in his mind and in his plans. The thin, ironic man of science had his quiet hour of satisfaction. As for our young reporter, in the end, he learned a plain thing and a gentle truth. Sometimes the things we seek, bravery, honor, the quick heat of a valiant moment, come to us dressed in odd clothes, as danger, as loss, as an ache, that makes us small and strong together. Sometimes we find only a stone where we hoped to find a crown. He returned and told his story he carried, I think at last, away from the plateau, not only a satchel of papers and a mind bright with new truths, but a plainer, steadier way of looking at the world. He had wanted to be hero for love, and he had been. He had come back, not to parades only, but to the slow, ordinary life in which small, honest actions make the days better. He had learned that love asks for the heart, but also for the steadiness to live on and to bring back a story. Here, by the snug, warm lamplight, the tale draws to its rest. We have walked the long river and climbed the sharp tree. We have heard the boom of the professor's voice and the hunter's laugh. We have seen a land where old things still live, where the cave walls tell the tales of ancient lives, where creatures that should have been dust turn out to be alive and slow under the sun. We walked with men who were brave and made mistakes, who were surprised and ashamed, who were wise and in all ways fully human. The plateau had a way of making truth and of teaching what humility and courage can do when they meet. Now let your breath slow, very slowly, like an oar dipped into a wide pool. Let your shoulders drop, and imagine the last hush of that plateau at the final dusk. The shadow of the cliff falling cool and long, the gentle stirring of leaves, the distant small splash of something in the deep lake. The great creatures roll themselves into the soft green. The one who loved truth folds his careful maps. The hunter lays his rifle aside like a tired tool. The reporter, whose heart beat once for action and for love, writes his final lines with a calm hand in a neat book. The small white waves of the river far below rock their heavy trade across the world. All is softly and kindly closed. Sleep now. Carry this story gently with you like a small stone in a pocket, heavy with memory, yet small enough to keep from stumbling. Let the sounds of these images, the hum of insects, the slow ripple of a lake, the hush of a page turned midnight, be the last things you listen to as sleep comes. Tomorrow, the ordinary world will still be there, with its measures and its small daylight chores. Tonight, you have walked a long and good road, and you have seen a land of wonder. Rest now. Let your breath be the oars, and let your heart be quiet. Good night, and when you wake, may you find the day gentle and your hand ready to do something true.